Step out of the vehicle. Now. Before I make you. The words came before Diane Okafor had even rolled her window all the way down, before Officer Dale Pruitt had seen her face clearly in the dark, before he had any reason in the world to say them other than the simple fact that her car had stopped at his checkpoint, and she was a black woman driving home alone at 11:47 in the evening, and something about that combination in his mind required a certain kind of greeting. Diane had left Greystone Memorial Hospital 40 minutes later than planned because Mr. Cartwright in bed 14 had coded just before shift change, and she had stayed the way she always stayed because that was who she was, and because the night crew coming on was short-staffed, and because some things mattered more than clocking out on time. She was still in her scrubs, the pale blue ones that smelled faintly of antiseptic and industrial soap. No matter how many times she washed them, and there was a small plastic bag on the passenger seat containing a turkey sandwich and a bag of chips and a bottle of orange juice that she had packed for James before leaving the house that morning, thinking he might want something when he got home from basketball practice. The kind of small, ordinary mothering gesture that fills the quiet spaces of a life. She had taken the east side route home the way she always did down Maple left on 14th. Then the long, straight stretch of Riverside Avenue that cut through the heart of the neighborhood she had lived in for 11 years. The neighborhood where she knew the names of the corner store owners and the church ladies, and the old men who sat on their porches, even in November, because the cold had stopped being something they noticed decades ago. The east side that had been there long before the city started holding press conferences about revitalization and renewal and community investment. All those soft-edged words that meant something hard was coming for the people who already lived there. The checkpoint appeared without warning around the curve at the intersection of Riverside and 9th. 2 patrol cars angled across the lanes with their light bars spinning lazy blue and red circles against the dark storefronts. Orange cones funneling the 2 lanes of traffic into a single narrow channel that ran past a cluster of officers standing in the road. There were no signs explaining the stop. No posted notice, no indication of a DUI checkpoint, or a safety initiative or any legal basis at all. Just cars being stopped and waved through with a rhythm that told Diane in the 30 seconds she spent watching before she reached the front of the line exactly who was getting waved through without delay. 3 cars had gone ahead of her. All 3 had white drivers. A man in a business suit, a woman in yoga clothes with a sticker on her rear window for a gym downtown, another man who looked like he was heading home from a dinner out, based on the way his jacket was loosened at the collar. All 3 had been waved through before they fully stopped a lazy hand gesture from the officer near the hood that said, "Keep moving. Nothing here to see." Diane pulled up and stopped completely the way she had been taught to stop at checkpoints going back further than driving school, going back to a different kind of training in a different kind of place, and she kept her hands on the wheel where they were visible, which was also something she had learned a long time ago and had never fully been able to unlearn. The officer who stepped into her headlights was tall, broad-shouldered, with a jaw set like he was already angry about something before he got there, and his name tag caught the light as he leaned toward her window, Pruitt. He shone his flashlight into the back seat first, sweeping it slowly across the empty upholstery, then across the passenger seat, pausing on the grocery bag, then swinging it back to her face, so that she had to squint against the brightness. He did all of this without saying a word, for almost 10 seconds, a practiced kind of silence that was designed to make you feel like you had already done something wrong. "License and registration," he said. Not please. Not good evening. Just the words, and behind them the weight of someone who had said them so many times in exactly this tone, that the tone itself had become the message. Diane handed them over without a word. Her hands were steady the way they were always steady when things got serious, which was another thing the Army had given her that she couldn't give back even when she tried. "Can I ask what this is for?" she said. His jaw tightened. Routine check for what? He pulled the flashlight away from her face and straightened up, scanning the sidewalk on both sides of the street, then looked back down at her with an expression that had moved from bored authority to something sharper. "Step out of the vehicle," he said. She did not step out. She kept her hands on the wheel and looked at him and said calmly and clearly and without any heat in her voice at all, "Am I being detained?" And that was the question that changed everything. The one small question that a tired nurse asked on a Tuesday night in November in a neighborhood that had never been treated like it mattered. The question that set in motion what was coming next, although none of them knew it yet. Not Pruitt, not Diane, not the man in the back of the second patrol car who was watching his phone and had not yet looked up. On the sidewalk outside the corner store 20 feet away, a heavy-set woman in a winter coat was standing with a plastic bag from the pharmacy hanging off her wrist, and she had been watching from the moment Diane pulled up because she recognized the car, and she recognized the stillness in the driver's seat. That meant whoever was behind that wheel was not going to be waved through like the others. Her name was Patrice Webb, and she reached into her coat pocket for her phone. Pruitt called his partner over with a gesture that wasn't quite a wave and wasn't quite a signal, but contained something of both the kind of body language that said, "I have a situation here, and I need a witness, or I need backup, or I need someone else to see that I am the one in control. And this woman in the car is the one who is not." And the younger officer, whose name tag read Lang, came around the passenger side of the car with his hand resting on his belt near the taser, in the practiced way of someone who had been taught that this position communicated readiness and authority and control. Diane had already made the calculation. She understood the geometry of what was happening. 2 officers, no supervisor visible, no recording equipment. She could clearly identify the checkpoint positioned just inside the curve where the view from the main road was partially blocked by the overhang of the old textile building, and the crowd on the sidewalk, small and scattered, a handful of people who had stepped outside to watch, but who had that particular quality of stillness that people in this neighborhood had developed over years and years of understanding, that watching too closely, or moving too close, or speaking too loudly at moments like this one was a form of participation that could go wrong in multiple directions. She had learned to read a situation the way a combat medic reads a casualty scene quickly, and without sentiment triaging for what is most urgent and what can wait and what cannot be changed at all. What she read now was that these men had already decided something before they approached her car, that the question she had asked had confirmed something they believed they already knew about her, and that whatever happened next was going to happen based not on what she did, but on what they had already decided she was. She reached for her phone. It was in the cup holder between the front seat screen, dark, and she moved her hand toward it slowly and with complete visibility, the same way you kept your movements slow and visible when there were people nearby who had guns and were looking for reasons. "Hands where I can see them," Pruitt said, and his voice had gone to a different register now, no longer bored, something tighter underneath it. "I am reaching for my phone," she said clearly, and for the record, because there was always a record, even when there was no camera. The record that existed in the memories of everyone present in the cells of the phones of everyone on the sidewalk, in the pattern of the evening itself. "I'm going to send a message." She got one text off. 5 words, and an address to a number that she had memorized 3 years ago and had never needed to use until this moment. Traffic stop, Riverside and 9th, no cause. Then Pruitt reached through the open window and grabbed the door handle from the inside and yanked, and the door swung open so hard it bounced on its hinges, and his hand closed around her upper arm through the thin fabric of her scrubs. Fingers digging in with a grip that was designed to control and did not particularly concern itself with whether it also hurt. And he pulled her out of the car and onto the pavement with the efficiency of someone who had done this before, many times, to many people who had asked questions they were not supposed to ask. She did not resist. Not a muscle of resistance, not a pull against the grip, not a word of protest beyond what she had already said on the record. She let her body go with the force of his pull the way they had taught her in close quarters training, because resistance gave people excuses, and she was not going to give anyone an excuse tonight. And she came out of the car and straightened up on the asphalt and kept her hands visible and looked at him with an expression that gave him nothing. No fear, no anger, no humiliation, nothing to work with. Lang was there immediately with the cuffs, and they went on too tight. The way cuffs went on when the person putting them on wanted them to hurt a little, and she felt the metal bite into the bones of her wrists and felt the first slow seep of warmth that meant skin had broken, and she said quietly and without emotion, "You're hurting me." Pruitt exhaled through his nose. Should have listened the first time he said. On the sidewalk, the plastic bag from the pharmacy swung gently against Patrice Webb's wrist as she held her phone up and pressed record. The grocery bag for James lay on the passenger seat of Diane's car door, still hanging open, and the orange juice inside had rolled against the door panel when they pulled her out and was slowly working its way toward the edge of the seat. In the back of the patrol car, separated from the front by a metal grate that smelled like sweat and old coffee and something acidic she couldn't identify, Diane sat with her hands cuffed behind her and let herself breathe. In through the nose 4 counts. Hold for 4. Out through the mouth for 4. It was the simplest thing, the most basic piece of regulation she had over her own body in this moment, and she used it the way she had used it in a half-collapsed building in Mosul in 2013, when the dust was so thick she couldn't see 3 feet in front of her, and the man she was working on had shrapnel in his chest, and was telling her in broken English that he had 3 daughters, and she needed to keep her hands steady. And she had kept them steady by breathing in the dark and counting and hold out the body doing what it knew how to do while the mind stayed clear. Pruitt got in the driver's seat and tossed her license and registration onto the dashboard, the way you'd toss junk mail. He adjusted the rearview mirror so he could see her face, which told her something, and then he glanced back at her with his eyes doing that particular narrowing thing that meant he was looking for a reaction, and was already composing a story around whatever he found. "Evelyn Carter," he said. Reading the name wrong, her name was Diane Okafor, which he either hadn't looked at carefully or didn't think was worth pronouncing. "Nurse. Lives over on Ashland." "Okafor," she said. "Diane Okafor." He continued as if she hadn't spoken. "Night shift. Works at Greystone." A pause. The pause of someone deciding how to use information. "You one of those ladies who takes the scrubs home and wears them to the grocery store, or did you actually just get off work?" "I just got off work," she said. "Long night?" "Yes." "Well." He glanced in the mirror again, caught her eyes, held them for a moment looking for something he didn't find. Shouldn't have made it longer. Lang got in on the passenger side, scrolling through something on his phone, and they pulled out from the checkpoint and began driving through streets she knew by heart. The back route through the east side that added 10 minutes to the trip to the station, but avoided the main roads and the cameras mounted on the traffic lights at the major intersections. She noticed the route. She noticed everything. "Says here she's ex-military," Lang said, still looking at his phone, the tone of someone reading trivia. "Lots of people are ex-military," Pruitt said. "Doesn't make them special." Diane said nothing. She watched the streets pass outside the window, the murals on the side of the old hardware store that someone had painted after the protests 2 summers ago. Bright figures in primary colors with their faces turned upward toward something the artist had decided to leave blank and let the viewer fill in the shuttered laundromat that had been there as long as she'd lived in the neighborhood and was now surrounded by plywood construction boards advertising luxury living. Coming soon, the row houses with their window boxes and their porch lights and their particular quality of life being lived close together and without pretense. She had brought James home to this neighborhood because it was a community and because it was affordable and because the school was good and because Mrs. Tatum next door had children the same age and because there were families here who had been here for 3 and 4 generations and who knew something about enduring that she had recognized and wanted to be near. She had brought him here, and she had made a life here, and she had never once thought the streets she drove home on at midnight were trying to tell her something until now. On the sidewalk, 20 blocks back, Patrice Webb was standing in the cold with a video on her phone that was 42 seconds long and shaking at the edges from the movement of her own hands, and showed very clearly a woman in blue hospital scrubs being pulled out of a stopped car by a police officer with no visible cause. And Patrice was looking at the video and looking at the empty space where the car used to be, and making a decision that she had not made 2 years ago, and that she was making now because there was a difference between seeing something happen and watching someone you had worked beside for 8 years be treated like a criminal for asking a question. She opened Facebook, typed 3 lines. Her thumbs shook so badly she had to correct the same word 4 times. Posted it. Then she called her sister, who was a paralegal downtown, and said, "What do I do with a video of a cop arresting someone for nothing?" And her sister said, "Don't delete it. Don't edit it. Send it to everyone you know." The interview room had that particular quality of spaces designed to make time feel elastic, to stretch it out until the person sitting inside started wondering whether they had miscounted the minutes and whether help was closer or further than they thought to let uncertainty work on a person. The way water worked on stone, not all at once, but steadily over time, through repetition and patience and the low-grade erosion of not knowing what was happening on the other side of the door. Diane had been sitting in it for 40 minutes when she heard footsteps that were different from all the others in the hallway, heavier with purpose and lighter with self-assurance. The footsteps of someone who had never in his life had to adjust his pace to accommodate someone else's comfort. The door opened and Councilman Richard Doyle walked in like he owned the room, which in some important technical sense he did, since the building was paid for with public money, and the council controlled the police department's budget, and the department's budget controlled the officers in it, and the officers in it had put Diane here, so there was a certain coherence to his entry, even if there was nothing legal about it. He was 55 years old, with the kind of face that had been conventionally handsome once and was now settling into something harder. Sharp cheekbones and a chin that came to an unexpectedly firm point under the softness of too many client dinners and too little sleep. And he had silver-white hair swept back from his temples in a way that suggested a stylist who understood the politics of trustworthiness. His suit was charcoal wool fitted in a way that cost money to achieve, and the watch on his left wrist was a Tag Heuer with a face like a small dark window into something expensive and impenetrable. He sat down across from her and folded his hands on the table and looked at her with the practiced warmth of someone who had spent decades in rooms like this one achieving outcomes that did not naturally occur. "Ms. Okafor," he said, and he said her name correctly, which meant he had looked at her file more carefully than Pruitt had. "I'm Councilman Richard Doyle. I want you to know I'm here because I want to help resolve this situation quickly and fairly for everyone involved." She said nothing, just looked at him. He let the silence sit for a moment, recalibrating, and then he opened his jacket and removed a folded piece of paper and smoothed it on the table between them. "What I'm proposing is straightforward," he said. "You sign a statement acknowledging that the stop tonight was lawful and that you were uncooperative with the officer's instructions. You pay a modest fine, $250. Everything goes away. No court date, no record, no ongoing complications." "You want me to sign a document saying I did something wrong?" Diane said. "I want to help you put this behind you so you can go home. I didn't do anything wrong." Doyle's smile stayed in place, but his eyes changed the way the surface of water changed when something large moved underneath it. "The officers have documented their version of events," he said. "In situations like these, Ms. Okafor perception matters as much as fact. And the perception at this moment is not favorable to you. Then we should probably get the facts established," she said. He studied her for a moment, then leaned slightly forward, and she could smell the gum or mouthwash on his breath spearmint the kind of fresh that was deliberate. "I want to be honest with you," he said in the tone of someone who said this sentence most often when they were about to be dishonest. "I've been involved in planning the development of this area for 2 years. Whitmore Heights is going to bring $180 million into this city, and it is going to transform this neighborhood into something that serves this community far better than what's here now. We need that project to move forward cleanly, without complications." He paused on the word cleanly, and she heard what he had not said, that she was one of the complications that people asking questions at checkpoints were complications that the entire East Side was a complication that needed to be managed and reduced until the space it occupied could be repurposed into something that did not contain the people who were currently living in it. "How many properties have you acquired so far?" she asked. He sat back. The smile disappeared completely. "I think you misunderstood what I—" "The property's in East Side," she said. "For the Whitmore Heights project." How many families have sold? Doyle stood up slowly, adjusting his cuffs with the deliberate precision of a man who used small, controlled gestures to reassert authority when larger ones were unavailable. "You have an hour to think about this," he said. "After that, the offer is gone, and this becomes considerably more complicated for you." He walked to the door and paused with one hand on the frame, his back to her, in the posture of someone who expected to be looked at and considered and feared. Then he walked out, and the door clicked closed behind him with the soft finality of something being sealed. Diane looked at the camera in the corner of the room, the red light still blinking on and off, steady as a pulse, and she thought, "He just told me everything I needed to know." Patrice Webb had been standing on the corner of Riverside and 9th for 6 minutes before the adrenaline of posting the video gave way to something quieter and colder. The particular stillness that came after. You did something you couldn't take back. And she realized that what she was feeling was not regret, but recognition. Recognition of the gap between the person she had been 2 years ago when she had driven away from a stop almost exactly like this one without saying a word to anyone, and the person she was now standing in the November dark with her phone in her hand and Diane Okafor's face still burning in her memory. 2 years ago, it had been Patrice's own car a Tuesday night. The same intersection, a different officer, but the same posture, the same flashlight sweep, the same calculation in the eyes that told her she had been selected not for what she had done, but for what she looked like doing it. They had kept her 20 minutes, checked her registration 3 times, asked twice where she was coming from as if the first answer hadn't been enough, and she had given them what they wanted. Compliance, soft voice, no challenges, and they had let her go. And she had driven home and sat in her dark living room for an hour trying to decide if what had happened counted as something, or if it was just the ordinary texture of a Tuesday and she was being too sensitive. She had decided it was ordinary. She had decided it was just the texture of things. She had made herself a cup of tea and gone to bed. She had been deciding that same thing in various forms for most of her adult life, and tonight she had finally gotten tired of it. The video was already spreading. She could see the share count ticking up in the corner of her screen, 12, then 27, then 41. In the time it took her to read the first handful of comments, people from the neighborhood who recognized the intersection. People from other parts of the city who recognized the scene. People who had their own versions of this story stored somewhere and were seeing it played back in someone else's footage and feeling something move in their chest. She called her sister, who told her not to delete it and to send it to everyone. She sent it to the local news tip line. She sent it to 3 community organizations whose numbers she had in her phone from volunteering at the food bank 2 summers ago. She sent it to the Facebook group for East Side residents that she had joined after the protests and rarely looked at anymore. She sent it to people in her contacts whose last names she barely remembered but who had grown up in the same streets and would know immediately and in their bodies what they were seeing. Then she walked to Greystone Memorial Hospital because it was 8 blocks away and she had left her umbrella in the break room that afternoon and she needed it because the sky had the particular heaviness of November rain coming, and also because Diane was her colleague and she needed somewhere to put what she was feeling. Some container for the mix of fury and helplessness and something almost like purpose that had settled over her since she pressed record. The night shift was in the middle of handover when she walked into the break room. Carol Mendez, the charge nurse for the overnight, was standing at the coffee machine with her hands wrapped around a mug and her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and she looked up when Patrice came in with the pharmacy bag still swinging off her wrist. And then she looked at Patrice's face and said, "What happened?" Patrice turned her phone around and showed her the video. Carol watched it without speaking. Then she said, "That's Diane." "Yes." Carol set down her coffee and turned toward the break room doorway and called down the hall. "Hey, everyone. Come look at this." And the ones who were nearby came, the ones finishing their charting, and the ones getting their coats on to leave, and the one who had been crying in the bathroom about something that had nothing to do with any of this, and came out red-eyed and then stood very still watching the screen. Roger Pitts, the shift supervisor, appeared in the doorway with a clipboard under his arm and looked at the cluster of nurses around Patrice's phone and said with the voice of someone who managed things by maintaining a careful distance from them, "All right, everyone, we've got a handover to finish and patients who need." "It's Diane," Carol said. "She got arrested on her way home from her shift." Roger looked at the phone, looked at the faces around him, looked at his clipboard. "I'm sure there's context we don't have," he said. "She asked if they had a reason to stop her," Patrice said. "That's the context." Roger opened his mouth and then closed it again and then said, "That's her business. It's not our business." And he walked back down the hallway with his clipboard, and the sound of his footsteps receded into the hospital's ambient hum of ventilation and monitors. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Carol said quietly to the room, "She's worked here 8 years. She covered my shift when my mother was dying. She has trained 17 new nurses in this hospital. She drove home from work at midnight and she got arrested for asking a question. She looked at each face. If that's not our business, then I don't know what is." Across town, in the kitchen of the house on Ashland, where the porch light was still on and the back door was still unlocked, because Diane had never yet come home to a locked door. In 11 years, James Okafor sat at the kitchen table with his basketball shoes still on, looking at the video on his phone and then looking at the dog tag hanging around his neck on a piece of paracord, the one he had found 6 months ago in a shoebox in the top shelf of his mother's closet, and had started wearing because he liked the way it felt heavy and substantial without knowing what it meant or who had worn it before. He looked at the video again, his mother's face through the window of a police car looking straight ahead at nothing. He looked at the name stamped into the dog tag, A. Reeves. He didn't know who A. Reeves was. He only knew that whatever his mother was, she was not the kind of person who needed him to fall apart. He picked up his phone and called Mrs. Tatum next door, and when she answered, he said, "Can you come over? My mom isn't home and I need someone here." And his voice only broke on the word home, which he thought was probably understandable, and she said she was already putting her shoes on. Pruitt came back at 2 a.m. without knocking, pushing the door of the interview room open hard enough that it swung fully back and hit the cinder block wall with a sound like a single clap. The kind of entrance that was meant to startle someone awake, or at least to demonstrate the possibility of startling. And then he stopped when he saw that Diane was sitting exactly as he had left her, back straight, hands folded in her lap, as much as the restraints allowed, eyes already on him when he walked in, as if she had been watching the door long enough to know exactly when it would open. He crossed the room in 3 strides and dropped a crumpled piece of paper and a pen onto the table in front of her. "Sign it," he said. She looked at the paper, looked at him, said nothing. He pulled the second chair out from the table and sat down heavily, spreading himself into the space the way men did when they wanted to communicate that the space belonged to them. "Here's what I want you to understand," he said, and his voice had a particular quality now, the quality it had when the performance for witnesses was over and he was speaking to someone he did not believe could do anything about what he said. "I have been doing this job for 11 years. 11 years of pulling people over, breaking up fights, running down people who thought they were smarter than me, and every single one of them, every single one thought the same thing. You're thinking right now that there was a way out of this that didn't involve giving me what I want." He paused. "There isn't. I want a lawyer," she said. "You want a lawyer." He repeated the words with the flat affect of someone who had decided they were funny. "Okay. Sure. You know how long it takes to get a public defender out here at 2 a.m? You know what you're going to be doing between now and whenever that happens." He gestured around the room. "This. I'm invoking my right to counsel," she said. "Under Miranda, you are required to stop questioning me." Something shifted in his face, a small tightening around the eyes that she recognized as the specific frustration of a man who had expected softness and found precision. "You watch a lot of legal shows," he said. "I went to school," she said. He stood up from the chair with a sudden energy that was meant to feel dangerous, like the contained explosion of something large moving in a small space, and he put his hands flat on the table and leaned toward her, and she held his gaze without difficulty and without aggression. Just the steady calm of someone who had decided a long time ago that she was not going to blink first for this kind of man, that she was not going to give him the performance of fear that he had come in here to collect. "Let me tell you something about yourself," he said, his voice low and close and hot with the smell of bad coffee and the stale end of a long shift. "You're a nurse from the East Side who decided tonight that she was going to be difficult. You don't have a lawyer on retainer. You don't have connections. You don't have anything except a job and a kid and a life that you worked hard to put together. And I can take all of that apart. You understand me. Every piece of it I can take apart, and I can bury the pieces where no one will find them. And by the time anyone looks up from their paperwork, you'll have a record that says you assaulted a police officer, and you'll have lost your nursing license, and you'll have a son who's watching his mother's name in the news for all the wrong reasons." He paused to let this settle. "Or you can sign the paper." She looked at him for a long moment, giving him nothing. Then she said, "I want a lawyer." He picked up the paper and crumpled it in his fist and threw it at her. It bounced off her shoulder and rolled under the table. He stood there, breathing through his nose, the vein in his temple visible and pulsing. And then he walked to the door and yanked it open and said without turning back, "Enjoy your cell." And the door slammed behind him with the force of someone who had run out of other ways to win. She sat in the silence he left behind and breathed. 4 in hold, 4 out 4. The camera in the corner blinked its steady red rhythm. The crumpled paper lay under the table where it had come to rest against the wall, half hidden in shadow. She looked at it and thought about the weight of what had been said in this room in the last few hours, the things that had been offered, and the threats that had been made. And she thought about Doyle with his development project and his $180 million vision of an East Side, emptied of the people who currently made it what it was. And she thought about the checkpoint on Riverside and 9th, and the 3 white drivers who had been waved through before she pulled up. And she thought about the fact that none of this was accidental, that there was a design underneath it that was older and more deliberate than one bad night, and she thought, "They have shown me exactly what this is." That was enough. That was, in fact, more than enough. The text message reached Leonard Hayes at 11:52 in the evening while he was sitting at his desk in a building whose address was not listed on any public directory, in a city that was used to buildings whose addresses were not publicly listed, reading a threat assessment that had nothing to do with Harwick County or East Side or a nurse named Diane Okafor. He read the message once. Then he stood up so quickly that his chair rolled backward and struck the credenza behind him, scattering a row of files that cascaded to the floor in a fan of paper, and the sound of it brought his deputy agent Nina Simmons to the doorway of the adjoining office within 3 seconds. "Sir, Diane Okafor is in custody," he said. He was already looking at his phone, running through the sequence of contacts. Harwick County PD. Traffic stop at Riverside and 9th. No cause given, no charges filed. Simmons stepped fully into the room. She was 38 years old, with the particular stillness of someone who had trained herself out of visible reactions, because visible reactions in her line of work were a form of information she didn't want to give away for free. "How long ago?" "Message came in 11:52. God knows when the stop actually happened." Hayes moved toward the door. "I need a full tactical team on site in 20 minutes. Federal override of local jurisdiction. Treat it as a security incident pending investigation." He grabbed his jacket from the hook beside the door. "Get me building schematics on Harwick PD surveillance coverage personnel files on every officer on duty tonight. And put the U.S. Attorney's Office on standby. If they've handled her incorrectly, I want paperwork moving before sunrise." What if it's a routine matter? What if she was? Hayes stopped in the doorway and looked back at her with an expression that was not quite patience. "Diane Okafor doesn't make routine trouble," he said. "In 15 years, I have never seen her miscalculate a situation. If she's in custody, she was put there. Pull everything." Simmons was already at her keyboard. In the war room down the hall, 3 analysts who had been working the overnight shift looked up as Hayes came through reading something in his pace that rearranged the priorities of the next several hours. While the team assembled and the SUVs were requisitioned and the warrants were begun, Simmons pulled 18 months of data from a database that Harwick County PD did not know existed, a quiet federal monitoring program that tracked stop patterns and arrest demographics in municipalities flagged for civil rights concerns. She had flagged Harwick County herself 6 weeks ago after a case involving a VA social worker named Robert Mensah, who had been held for 48 hours on a charge that evaporated on contact with a public defender. She had written a memo. The memo was still in review. She put it on Hayes's desk with the data underneath it. The data told a story that was organized and intentional and ugly in its clarity. 247 traffic stops in 18 months, concentrated in 3 specific neighborhoods: East Side, Lakewood Heights, and Parkside West. 89% of the people stopped were Black or Latino. Stops in majority white areas of Harwick County accounted for less than 4% of the total, and virtually all of those involved documented traffic violations, a red light run and expired registration, an actual speeding infraction. The checkpoint stops in East Side and the other 2 neighborhoods had something different at their core. Almost none of them cited a specific violation as the basis for the stop. They had simply stopped people, looked at them, searched their cars when they could with or without consent, arrested some of them for asking questions for not moving fast enough for the particular offense of seeming like someone who believed they had rights. Simmons cross-referenced the checkpoint locations with property records. The checkpoints formed a rough perimeter around a parcel of land that had been under development negotiation for 2 years. A parcel called Whitmore Heights in the city planning documents owned by a holding company called Riverside Ventures, LLC, whose managing partner was listed as a financial trust administered by a man named Alan Kramer, a name she did not yet recognize, though she would. The property values in the 3 targeted neighborhoods had dropped 14% in the last 18 months. 3 major community anchor businesses had closed. Several churches had sold their buildings and relocated. 52 families, according to property transfer records, had sold homes they had lived in for an average of 22 years in the last 12 months. Simmons put all of this into a document and labeled it Preliminary Findings Harwick County and sent it to Hayes's phone as he was pulling onto the highway. He read it at a red light and called her back. "How long have they been running this?" he said. Best estimate, it started shortly after the city council approved the Whitmore Heights preliminary development plan, she said, which was about 20 months ago. And Doyle's name is on the council vote. Doyle cast the deciding vote. Hayes was quiet for a moment. "Get me everything you can find on Richard Doyle. Bank records, property holdings, any business entity he's connected to directly or indirectly." A pause. "And find out who else has been stopped at that checkpoint. Not just the ones who were charged, all of them. I've already started." He hung up and drove through the dark with the lights off on the SUV, the way you drove when you wanted to arrive before anyone was expecting you. Mrs. Tatum came through the back door at 12:15 with her housecoat still on, and her feet in the foam-soled slippers she wore for everything that didn't require leaving the block. And she found James sitting at the kitchen table with his basketball shoes tied and a glass of water. He hadn't drunk, and his phone face up on the table, the video of his mother still open on the screen, frozen on the last frame. She sat down across from him and didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at the phone and then at him, the way older women looked at things when they were deciding how much truth the situation called for. "I've seen the video," she said, finally. "I know who sent it," he said. "Ms. Patrice. She works with my mom. Your mother is going to be all right. I know she is." He said this quickly with the certainty of someone who had decided it was true and was not interested in the alternative. "That's not what I'm thinking about." "What are you thinking about?" He touched the dog tag at his throat. It was a reflex he had developed since he started wearing it the way people touched rosaries or rings, not quite prayer, not quite superstition, something in between. "I found this 6 months ago," he said, "in a box in her closet. She told me to put it back, but she never explained what it was. He looked at Mrs. Tatum. "Do you know anything about what she did in the Army?" Mrs. Tatum shook her head slowly. "Diane has never told me a thing about that time. She never told me either." James turned the tag in his fingers. "I looked up the name after I started wearing it. Anthony Reeves, from Savannah. He died in Afghanistan in 2011. He was 22. A pause. "I think she knew him." Mrs. Tatum was quiet. "She doesn't put things on the wall," James said. "She doesn't have those shadow boxes some veterans have, or the pictures, or the flag. She has one box in her closet, and this is what's in it." He set the dog tag down on the table. "I don't know what that means. I just know she kept it for a reason." The shares on the video were still ticking up on Patrice's Facebook post, and the neighborhood Facebook group had 37 comments on a repost of the same video. And somewhere in the notification stream on James's phone, there were messages from school friends and their parents, and people he barely knew who had seen his mother's face and were sending him things they thought might help. He hadn't answered any of them. He would answer them when there was something to say, when his mother was home, when the night had resolved itself into the morning it needed to become. He was 16, and he had been raised by a woman who had never in his memory used the words, "I can't," and meant them, who got up early and came home late and sat with him at the kitchen table every Sunday evening to go over his week and ask him what he needed and tell him what she noticed, and who had never not once talked about the years she spent in uniform, except to say that it taught her that most things that seemed impossible were not actually impossible, they were just hard, and that there was a difference between those two things that mattered enormously. He didn't fully understand what she did now, the part of her work that was not the hospital. He understood that there were phone calls she took in her car with the windows up, and that there was a contact in her phone labeled simply Hayes, that she had told him once, almost offhandedly, to call if anything ever happened to her, and she was unreachable, and he had filed this information away without pressing on it, because he had learned from her by watching that some information was not a secret so much as a context you had to earn your way into through patience. Tonight he thought he had probably earned it. He picked up the dog tag and held it in his palm, not wearing it, just holding it. And he thought about a 22-year-old from Savannah who had died in a place his mother had also been, and about what it meant that she had kept this small piece of metal for 13 years without explaining it to anyone, and about the fact that she had been wearing blue hospital scrubs and driving home at midnight when they put her in handcuffs, and she had not made a sound about it that he could identify as fear. He thought she is in there doing exactly what she always does, breathing in for 4, holding for 4, breathing out. "She's going to walk out of there," he said. "Of course she is," Mrs. Tatum said. "And when she does," he said, "I want to know about Corporal Reeves." Doyle came back at 2:30 in the morning, and this time there was nothing warm in his entry. No smooth opener, no folded proposal, no performance of reasonableness. He sat down in the chair across from Diane with the posture of someone who had made a decision in the parking lot before coming in and was here to deliver the result, not to negotiate it. He opened a file folder and read from it in a tone that was meant to strip the subject matter of personality to make her into a dossier entry rather than a person. And she recognized the technique because she had been on the other side of it in briefings and interrogations in 3 different countries, and had used it herself on occasion when she needed to think clearly about something whose human element was making clarity harder. The difference was that she had never used it on a civilian in a chair across a narrow table in a police station at 2 in the morning. "Diane Okafor," he said. 44 years old. Registered nurse. ICU Greystone Memorial, 8 years. Single parent. Son James, 16, attends Eastside High School. He looked up. Good grades. Basketball player. She held his gaze and said nothing. No significant savings. House on Ashland mortgage current but barely. He flipped a page. Military service, honorably discharged 2018. No active affiliations. He said this last part with a certain emphasis that told her he had the civilian version of her file, the version that did not contain the part of her life that mattered right now. No significant institutional backing. No union. No... "You're using my son," she said. He stopped. "You just told me his age and his school and his grades," she said. And her voice was still even and controlled, but there was something underneath it now that was different from what had been there before. Something harder and more particular. The specific quiet that came not from the absence of feeling, but from the decision to keep it contained. "You're using him as part of your offer, as part of—" Doyle set the folder down. "I'm establishing context," he said. "I want you to understand what you have at stake." "I understand exactly what I have at stake," she said. "My question is what you have at stake. Excuse me." "The Whitmore Heights project," she said. "You told me about it earlier. $180 million. You said it needed to move forward cleanly." She let that word sit in the air between them for a moment. How many families in Eastside have sold their homes in the last 18 months? Doyle's face went through something that was not quite surprise and not quite calculation, but some compound of both the face of someone recalibrating. "I don't see what that has to do with." "You're running checkpoints to make people feel unsafe," she said. "You arrest the ones who push back because a criminal record drops a family's ability to fight you in court when you try to take their home. And when the fear and the arrests and the citations and the costs have added up long enough, people sell, and what they sell for is less than what it's worth because the value has been driven down by the same pressure you helped create." She looked at him steadily. "That's not a development plan. That's a displacement operation." The silence that followed had a different quality from the ones before it. Doyle sat very still. "You used the phrase, 'made this area viable,'" she said. "In the context of the project. You mean cleared of the people currently living here?" "You're making a considerable number of assumptions," he said, and his voice had gone carefully flat in the way voices went when the speaker was no longer entirely sure of the ground under their feet. "You just told me the project was worth $180 million, and that it needed to move forward cleanly, and that I was a complication," she said. "I'm not making assumptions, I'm listening." Doyle stood up. He picked up the folder. He straightened his jacket lapels in the gesture of a man who needed something physical to do with his hands while he recovered his bearing, and she watched him do it and filed it away with everything else. The flush at the edge of his jaw, the slightly faster blink rate, the way he had picked up the folder before he was quite ready to leave, because the folder gave him something to do with the movement of his exit. "The offer stands until 4 o'clock, he said. "After that, this goes in a different direction, and I want you to understand that the direction it goes will not be one you can reverse." She looked at him from the chair hands still in her lap, and she said quietly, and without any particular emphasis, "You've given me everything I need." He stopped walking. Just for a half-second, the foot mid-step, the door almost reached the whole departure almost complete. Then he pushed through, and it swung shut behind him. She sat in the room and breathed. The camera blinked. The crumpled paper was still under the table where it had come to rest against the wall an hour ago. She thought about the file that did not have the correct version of her history in it. The civilian file, the public record. The thing that described her as a nurse and a mother and a veteran with an honorable discharge, all of which was true, and none of which was the whole picture. She thought about Leonard Hayes, who had trained her in a different kind of patience, the patience of people who understood that the most effective kind of pressure was the kind that waited for the right moment, rather than pushing on every moment with the same force. She thought the right moment is arriving. She thought I have been waiting for it since I pulled up to that checkpoint. She thought it should be here in approximately 11 minutes, given the text I sent and the response protocol and the distance between here and where Hayes would have been when he received it. She let her eyes close for a few seconds. Not sleep. Just rest the way you rested in the field when the next movement was close, and the intervening time was not for sleep, but was also not for wasting. Then she opened her eyes and waited. The detective who caught the case was a man named Hollis, 29 years old, 8 months out of detective school, assigned to the overnight administrative desk because he was new, and the overnight desk was where you put people who were new and who needed to learn the geography of the job before anyone trusted them with the terrain that mattered. He was the kind of young man who had joined the force because he genuinely believed in the idea behind it. which was an idea that his first 8 months had subjected to considerable stress, and who had not yet arrived at the comfortable pragmatism that would either corrode the idea entirely or compress it into something he could actually live with. He ran Diane's name through the system as a routine matter, the way he ran every name that came through the overnight intake process, because the system existed and running names through it was what you did, and the system returned something he had not seen before in 8 months of using it. A flag, red, triple-starred, 3 separate federal database notifications firing simultaneously with a 4th line appearing below them that he had to read twice to be sure he was reading correctly. He ran it again. Same result. He checked the badge number he had used to log in, thinking he had accidentally entered someone else's credentials, that there had been a clerical error somewhere in the chain. His credentials were correct. The result was the same. He sat in front of the screen for approximately 30 seconds doing nothing, which was under the circumstances one of the more rational responses available. Then he got up and walked to the sergeant's desk and put the tablet down on the blotter without saying a word, and the sergeant looked at it, and the color left his face in a way that reminded Hollis of the specific physiological presentation of people who had just received news they had been unconsciously hoping would never arrive. The phone on the sergeant's desk rang at 3:14 in the morning. The voice on the other end was a woman calm with the precision of someone for whom calm was professional infrastructure rather than emotional state, who identified herself and her agency in 3 sentences and then asked for the officer on duty to confirm that Diane Okafor was currently in custody, and could the duty officer please confirm the charges, and would anyone be able to explain why Ms. Okafor had been denied access to counsel. The sergeant said he would need to look into it. The woman said he had about 4 minutes before her director called on a separate line, and that the conversation with the director would be more direct. The second call came at 3:18. It was Hayes, and he did not waste time on courtesy, and when he told the duty sergeant what he needed, and by when the duty sergeant said, "Yes, sir," without hesitation, which was the only sensible available response, Captain Hendricks was called at home. He arrived 22 minutes later in clothes that had been put on in the dark, unshaven, with the particular expression of a man who had spent 30 years in law enforcement and understood immediately and exactly what it meant when a federal deputy director called his direct line about a person in his custody. He went to his computer and pulled Diane's full file, the complete file, not the civilian summary, but the classified record that required 3 separate verification steps to open, and he sat in his office with the door closed and read it. And when his deputy knocked 20 minutes later to tell him the federal vehicles were in the parking lot, he said, "Get her out of holding. Right now. Not in 5 minutes. Right now." Hollis, standing in the hallway outside the captain's office, heard this through the door, and something settled in him that he hadn't known was unsettled. He went to get a paper cup of water to bring to the woman in interview room 3 because it was 3 in the morning and she had been in there for hours, and it was the only thing in his power to do at this particular moment that counted as something rather than nothing. The parking lot at the rear of Harwick County PD had a specific quality of institutional bleakness in the small hours of the morning, the sodium lights making everything the color of old newsprint. The chain-link fence at the far edge casting repetitive grid shadows on the cracked asphalt. The building itself sitting there with its barred windows and its brick facade the deep red-brown of old blood, looking like what it was, a place where the business of power was conducted without particular ceremony or self-examination. 8 black SUVs rolled into that parking lot at 3:31 in the morning with their lights off and their engines at low idle, moving in the coordinated quiet of people who had done this kind of thing before and did not feel the need to announce themselves through their approach. They came in 2 columns of 4, peeling off to designated positions along the perimeter of the lot, in a pattern that closed the exits without obstruction, which was a precise distinction from blocking them. And the people who stepped out moved with the specific economy of motion that came from having trained for this kind of situation until it was no longer interesting, only necessary. Hayes stepped out of the lead vehicle last. Gray overcoat, no insignia, hands loose at his sides, and he stood for a moment in the parking lot looking at the building with the stillness of someone who was not making a decision, but had made one already some time ago and was simply arriving at the location the decision pointed toward. The federal agents and analysts and the two people in plain clothes whose role was not advertised by their appearance spread across the lot and the front entrance in positions that did not look like positions if you were watching from the parking lot, but looked very much like positions if you were, for instance, watching from the break room window where two officers who had been eating pizza 40 minutes ago were now standing very still holding slices they had forgotten they were holding. Pruitt saw the vehicles from the hallway and had the specific response of a man who understood immediately what they meant and whose mind went without his permission. To the details of the evening, he would most prefer not to be on record somewhere. The cuffs a notch too tight, the paper he had thrown at her, the things he had said in the interview room when he believed the camera was not a concern, the way he had told her that he could take her life apart piece by piece and bury the pieces where no one would find them. He stood in the hallway watching the parking lot through the window and did not move for a full minute. Doyle, who had not left the building, because Doyle was a man who believed that leaving before a thing was finished was a form of weakness, saw the vehicles from the window of the small conference room where he had been making phone calls since 2:45, and he made one more call, a short one, to a number he did not want logged in the building's system. And then he put the phone in his breast pocket and walked to the window and stood there watching Hayes cross the parking lot. And he understood in the way that people who have built things understand when the thing begins to come apart, not all at once, but at the load-bearing points, first the quiet structural failure that preceded the visible collapse. Hayes came through the front entrance at 3:33, showed credentials to the officer at the desk, who looked at them and then looked at the 7 people entering the building behind Hayes and said nothing, and Hayes asked for the captain in a tone that required the person receiving the request to move toward the fulfillment of it immediately, and the request was fulfilled. In Captain Hendrick's office, Hayes laid out the situation in 12 sentences without raising his voice, without any visible emotion in the way that facts became more authoritative the more plainly they were stated. He named the federal statutes at issue. He named the rights that had been violated, and when, and by whom. He told Hendricks what was being transferred to federal jurisdiction, and what would be retained locally, and under what supervision. He told Hendricks what was about to happen to every officer who had touched Diane Okafor that evening. He told Hendricks what the investigation would cover and how long it would take and what cooperation was required. Hendricks listened to all of this with his hands flat on his desk and his face very still, the face of a man trying to do the accounting of a 30-year career in real time, calculating what was salvageable and what was already gone. When Hayes finished, Hendricks said, "Is she injured?" Hayes looked at him for a moment, recalibrating the man slightly upward from his initial estimate. "Minor abrasions," he said. "We'll be conducting a full medical review. I want her out of holding immediately," Hendricks said. "I want those officers sequestered, and I want you to know." He stopped. "Yes, I want you to know that what happened tonight is not what this department is supposed to be," he said. It was a small thing to say. It was also the first honest thing anyone in the building had said since Diane's car pulled up to the checkpoint. Hayes nodded once. "Get her," he said. Hollis opened the door of interview room 3 and found Diane sitting in the same position she had been in when he last checked 40 minutes ago, back against the chair. Hands in her lap. Eyes forward as if she were waiting for a bus, rather than for the resolution of a night that had been designed by people with power and calculation and no particular concern for her to go differently than it was going. He set the paper cup of water on the table. She looked at it, looked at him. "Ma'am?" he said, and then stopped because he had prepared something to say, and now that he was in the room, it seemed insufficient in ways he couldn't quickly articulate. "They're ready for you up front." She stood without hurrying. She was a tall woman, he noticed, not in an imposing way, but in a way that suggested she occupied the full vertical dimension of herself without apology. And she straightened and picked up the water and drank it in 2 swallows and set the cup back on the table and then walked to the door, which he held open, and they went down the hallway together. The hallway had changed from when they had walked it in the other direction 3 hours ago. The casual clusters of officers who had been moving through the space without much consideration had reorganized themselves into smaller, quieter configurations. Groups of 2 or 3 speaking in voices too low to carry with the particular body language of people who were watching and calculating and could not entirely prevent these activities from showing on their faces. Several of them looked at Diane as she walked past and then looked away, and the looking away was informative in its own right, the looking away of people who were not sure what they had been a party to and were hoping the uncertainty would eventually resolve itself in their favor. Pruitt and Lang were visible through the glass panel of a conference room, sitting in chairs against the far wall, not speaking, both of them with the posture of people who had been told to stay put and were complying because non-compliance had become obviously more expensive than compliance. Pruitt was looking at the floor. Lang was looking at his hands. Doyle was in the corner of the hallway near the exit to the parking lot, and he had the appearance of a man who had intended to leave and had been unable to make himself take the last steps. And when Diane passed him, he was standing very still with his arms crossed and his jaw set in the way that people set their jaws when they were suppressing something that wanted to move upward into their expression. She stopped walking and she looked at him, and she held the look for exactly 3 seconds. Not in hostility, not in triumph, but in the specific quality of attention she gave to things she needed to remember accurately, and then she continued walking and he watched her go. In the front lobby, Hayes was waiting. He was not a man who made gestures of comfort easily, and he did not make one now, but he looked at her with the full attention of someone who was taking inventory of damage, and his eyes stopped on her wrists where the marks from the cuffs had dried brown-red against her skin. "Are you injured?" he said. "No." He studied the wrists for another moment. "The medic will look at those." "All right. I need you to tell me one thing before we go outside," he said. "Did you sign anything?" "No." "Did they record your statements without informing you?" The camera in the interview room was on the whole time. "Good." He meant it, which surprised her, and then it didn't surprise her because, of course, Hayes would want that footage. "We'll need everything on that camera, the entire night." They walked out through the front entrance into the November air, and it hit her differently than she expected. Not the cold, but the openness of it, the smell of rain coming and the sound of traffic in the distance and the quality of the sky that told her the time. Without looking at a clock somewhere between 3 and 4, the absolute bottom of the night before it started climbing back toward morning. A federal medic met her at the base of the steps and looked at her wrists under a portable light. She held still and let him work. Hayes stood nearby on the phone, his voice low and exact and entirely without warmth, the voice of someone who was initiating processes. She looked back at the building. Through the lobby windows, she could see officers still moving in small clusters, phones in hands, the ambient bureaucracy of a small police department, realizing that the next several months were going to be unlike anything in its institutional memory. She could see the outline of Hendricks through the glass of his office window, standing rather than sitting, which told her something about the state he was in. She thought about Robert Mensah and Sandra Ngozi and Thomas Ayula, whose names she did not yet know, but whose situations she was already beginning to construct from the patterns that Hayes's team had started pulling together, the 247 stops, the 89% the families who had sold. Hayes came back to where she was standing. "Car's ready," he said. She took a breath of the cold air and held it for a moment, and then she let it go and she said, "Before we leave, who else has been stopped at that checkpoint?" He looked at her for a moment. "We're already pulling the list. I want to meet them," she said. "Not as a federal matter, as a neighbor." He nodded, once the nod of someone recalculating a person upward for the second time in an hour. "We can arrange that." She got in the car. Behind her, the building's lobby lights reflected in the wet asphalt of the parking lot, orange-yellow wavering. The car pulled away and she did not look back. She woke at 10 in the morning to the smell of coffee and the sound of a car engine from the street below that idled with a specific quality she recognized as a government vehicle. and she lay in the dim of her bedroom for a moment doing the inventory she always did upon waking in unfamiliar circumstances. Where was she? What had happened? What was the most urgent next thing? She was home. The night had happened the way it had happened. The most urgent next thing was to be present for James. She came downstairs in sweats and found 2 federal agents in her living room, one reading a physical book which struck her as unusual, and the other looking at a phone with the focused expression of someone managing something complicated, and James sitting at the kitchen table with coffee already made wearing his basketball shoes, even though it was 10 in the morning, which was something he did when he was anxious without knowing it, as if being ready to move was a form of preparation for whatever was coming. He looked at her when she came in, and she looked at him, and in the brief transaction of that look was everything that needed to be said about what the night had cost and what it had not cost. And then he said, "I made coffee," and she said, "Thank you," and sat down across from him at the table where they had eaten breakfast together 1,000 mornings. She told him about Corporal Anthony Reeves for the first time. Not everything, not all at once, but the core of it. Kandahar, 2011. A 22-year-old from Savannah, Georgia, with a sister and a mother, and a photograph in his breast pocket that she had seen when she was trying to save him, and she had not been able to save him, and she had kept his dog tag, because there was no other way she could find to say, "I knew you were here. I tried. You mattered." James listened without interrupting. When she finished, he reached up and touched the dog tag at his throat, and then he unfastened it from the paracord and placed it in the center of the table between them. Not giving it back, not taking it away, just placing it in the space between them where both of them could see it. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" he said. "Because I hadn't finished deciding what it meant," she said. He looked at the dog tag. "Have you now?" "I think so," she said. "I think it means that the fact that you can't save someone doesn't mean you stop trying." Her phone had 64 missed calls. She did not look at them for another hour. When she finally did, she found texts from Carol and 3 other colleagues, a message from the ACLU's local office, a voicemail from a number she didn't recognize that turned out to be Sandra Ngozi, a teacher, a name she would later know well, who said only, "I saw the video. I've been stopped there 4 times. I never thought I could say something. Maybe I can now." And one text from Hayes. "Meeting this afternoon, 2 p.m. We need your statement and your help." She typed back, "There before you finish typing." The federal building downtown was glass and steel and security layers and the particular brand of deliberately unremarkable architecture that said nothing visible from the outside about what happened inside. And Diane went through the metal detector and signed the log and was escorted to the 4th floor by an agent who walked ahead of her and didn't make small talk, which she appreciated. Hayes met her in the hallway and led her to a conference room where Simmons was waiting with a laptop and a stack of documents and a whiteboard that already had the beginning of something diagrammed on it in 2 colors of marker, and they sat down and Simmons started talking. The data was 18 months of traffic stop records cross-referenced with demographic information at the census tract level, and the picture it made when you laid it out geographically was not subtle. Simmons had printed the map at 2 feet by 3 feet and taped it to the wall, and the color coding was simple red for East Side Blue for Lakewood Heights, green for Parkside West. The dots representing stops clustered in those 3 areas, with the density of a rash spreading outward from the intersection of Riverside and 9th in every direction within the neighborhood's boundaries, and stopping almost perfectly at the lines that separated those neighborhoods from the adjacent areas. 89% of the people stopped were Black or Latino. Less than 4% of stops in majority white areas of the county had occurred, and essentially all of those involved documented traffic violations. The stops in the 3 targeted neighborhoods did not as a group cite specific violations as their primary basis. They were just stopping people, Simmons said, checking who was there, checking if they'd push back. And if they pushed back, Diane asked, they arrested them. The charges were almost always minor obstruction, disorderly conduct, resisting, expensive to fight, easy to accept. 73% of the people arrested in this data set took plea deals without going to trial. Diane looked at the map. She knew those streets. She had driven every one of them. How does this connect to Doyle and the development project, she asked. Simmons pulled up the property records overlay. The Whitmore Heights development parcel sat at the center of the 3 red, blue, and green areas like a bullseye, and the checkpoint locations formed a rough perimeter around its edges. The largest concentration of stops, including the intersection where Diane had been stopped, sat at the primary entrance and exit points for the neighborhoods closest to the parcel. Property values in these 3 areas have dropped 14% in 18 months, Simmons said, compared to a county average increase of 6%. They drove the values down, Diane said. On purpose, deliberately. We've found an email between Doyle and his chief of staff that uses the phrase increased discomfort in reference to policing levels in East Side. Simmons paused. The email was sent 9 days after the first checkpoint was established. Diane looked at the map for a long moment. 52 families sold in the last year, she said. I didn't know the number until now, but I know some of those families. Mrs. Patterson on 11th, the Kirby family. They said the neighborhood didn't feel safe anymore. They didn't know the feeling was manufactured. The room was quiet. What do you need from me? She said. Hayes, who had been standing at the window, turned. We need witnesses from the community who were directly affected, people who were stopped, arrested, harassed, people whose property values dropped because of this, people who sold because they were pressured. He paused. We have the data, but data doesn't convict. People do. Diane nodded slowly. I know who to call, she said. She met them over the course of 3 days in coffee shops and living rooms, in the parking lot of a church that had been there before any of them were born, the people whose encounters with the checkpoint on Riverside and 9th had not ended with federal SUVs in a parking lot. Robert Mensah was 47, a mechanic with hands that showed the evidence of his work and a voice that had gone careful in the way voices went careful after something happened that taught you that speaking directly could have direct consequences. He had been arrested 7 weeks before Diane held for 2 nights and had signed a plea agreement, not because he believed he had done anything wrong, but because his lawyer, a public defender stretched across 4 courtrooms and 16 cases, simultaneously had told him that fighting it would cost $800 he didn't have, and 3 days of work he couldn't miss, and he had a daughter who needed braces and a landlord who did not give extensions. He had signed. His record now showed a misdemeanor that had not been there before. I knew it was wrong, he told Diane, sitting across from her at a table in the corner of a diner that smelled like coffee and old cooking oil, his hands wrapped around a mug he wasn't drinking from. I just couldn't afford to be right about it. Sandra Ngozi was a 3rd-grade teacher who had been stopped at the same intersection 4 times in 3 months, searched twice without finding anything, and had filed a formal complaint with the city council that had received a response. 11 weeks later, your matter has been reviewed and addressed according to established procedures. She had made copies of the complaint and the response and the original and the follow-up she had sent and the second non-response she had received, and she brought them to the meeting in a manila folder organized by date with sticky tabs on the relevant sections because she was a teacher and she believed in documentation, and she had believed for 3 months that the documentation would eventually matter to someone. I felt like I was going crazy, she said. Like I was making a problem out of something that everyone else was deciding to accept. Like the normal response was to just drive a different route and not think about it. She paused. I couldn't drive a different route. It was the only way home. Thomas Ayula was 29, a final-year medical student who had been walking home from the library at 11 in the evening when the checkpoint officers had stopped him on foot. Not in a vehicle on foot, and asked him to explain where he was going and who he had been with, and whether he had any identification, and had then called him in for a check that lasted 6 hours, during which he had asked for a lawyer, and been told that lawyers were for people who had been formally arrested, and he had not yet been formally arrested. a distinction that, as he was now learning in a different context, was meaningfully incorrect. "I spent the whole time trying to figure out what I had done," he said. "I kept running through everything I'd done that day, that week, trying to find the thing that had made me worth stopping." He looked at Diane. "It took me a long time to understand that there wasn't a thing, that I was just there." When Thomas finished speaking, Diane was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Will you testify?" He looked at her, then at Robert, then at Sandra, then back at Diane. "If I testify," he said, "what happens to me after I still live here? I still go to school here. I still need to walk home at night." It was a fair question. It was the question that was always underneath every conversation like this. The question that people with institutional protection rarely had to think about, because the institution was still there when the conversation ended. "I won't be going anywhere until this is done," Diane said, "and I'll tell you what I can guarantee and what I can't. I can guarantee that you'll be a protected federal witness while proceedings are active. I can't guarantee that no one will ever look at you the wrong way again. What I can tell you is that if no one does this, if all three of you decide it's too risky and you walk away from it, they will keep doing what they've been doing to the next person and the person after that, and the checkpoint will come back in a different form, and the plea agreements will accumulate, and the families will keep selling." She looked at each of them. "That's not a speech. That's just what the data says." Robert Mensah set his coffee mug down and looked at his hands. Then he said, "All right, I'll do it." Sandra had already nodded before he finished the sentence. Thomas was slower, and she respected the slowness, the weight of it, the fact that he was genuinely counting the cost rather than performing bravery. When he finally said yes, it was a quiet yes, the kind that came from somewhere considered and real. "One more thing," Robert said as they were getting up to leave. "That nurse on the news, the one who got stopped, is that you?" "Yes," she said. He nodded slowly. "I saw the video. My daughter showed me." He paused. "I kept thinking if she'd just told them what she was, if she'd just said something that made them stop." He looked at her. "Why didn't you?" She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Because you couldn't." He didn't say anything. He just nodded very slowly, the nod of someone receiving something they had needed to hear for longer than the present conversation. The confrontation happened in the supply closet hallway, which was not a grand location, but was the location where Patrice found Roger at 6 in the evening, making himself a cup of tea from the electric kettle that was kept there, rather than the break room. Because the break room had become, over the past 3 days, a space charged with the specific electricity of people who had decided what they thought and were having continuous low-volume arguments about it with people who had decided differently. Roger saw her coming and did the thing he had been doing all week, the slight adjustment of posture and pace that was not quite a retreat but was clearly the intention of one. And Patrice said, "I need 5 minutes," and Roger said he had patients to see, and she said, "Roger, I need 5 minutes." He stopped. He looked at the electric kettle. He said, "Fine." She told him about 2 years ago. The stop on Riverside, the 20 minutes, the flashlight in her face, the questions about where she was going and who she had been with, the polite voice she had kept the entire time, because she had learned somewhere in her life that the polite voice was the survival voice, and that departing from it even for a second could change outcomes in ways she was not willing to risk. She had told no one. Not her sister, not her friends, not any of the colleagues she had worked alongside for years. She had driven home and sat in her dark living room and decided it was just the texture of things. "I have been deciding it was just the texture of things," she said, "for most of my adult life, and I am tired of it." Roger looked at her, and she could see him deciding in real time whether the thing she had just said was something he had the capacity to hear fully, or whether he was going to root it through the part of himself that processed things by managing them into something smaller. Diane asked one question, Patrice said. "One. And they put her in a cell for 5 hours and threatened her job and tried to get her to sign a paper saying she'd done something wrong." She paused. "And I think you know, Roger, that the only reason this is in the news is because of what she turned out to be. The only reason anyone cares is because of the federal credentials and the agents in the parking lot. And if you know that too, then you know what it means for everyone it happened to who didn't have those things." Roger said nothing for a long moment. "Then I was wrong," he said. "What I said in the break room, about it not being our business." A pause. "I knew it was wrong when I said it. I said it anyway because it was easier." Patrice looked at him. "I know," she said. "I've been doing easier for 2 years." She left him in the hallway with his kettle. She was not angry at him exactly. She was something more complicated than angry, the compound feeling of recognizing yourself in someone else's failure, and being grateful that you had finally, however belatedly, stepped away from it. The nurses had been organizing for 3 days. A rally at City Hall, a petition with 412 signatures. A coordinated call from the ACLU chapter, and a formal complaint filed with the state nursing board on behalf of the profession, asserting that the arrest of a nurse at the end of a patient care shift with no cause and no charge constituted an attack on the conditions of healthcare work in the county. Roger Pitts found the petition on the break room table the next morning and picked it up and read it through twice, standing at the coffee machine, and then he asked Carol for a pen, and Carol handed him one, and he signed his name at the bottom of the list below all the others. Carol watched him set the pen down. "Took you a while?" she said. "Yes," he said. "It did." She picked up the petition and looked at his signature. "Better late than not at all," she said. Not in forgiveness, but in the honest register of someone who understood that the accounting of these things was rarely clean. Then she folded the petition and put it in her pocket and went back to work. The encrypted email arrived on Hayes' secure server at 11:44 in the evening, 2 days after Diane's arrest. Subject line, blank sender address routing through a relay chain that his IT team would spend 3 days trying to trace before arriving at a server in Eastern Europe, and a dead end. The file contained 183 pages of financial records, wire transfer documentation, internal communications, and audio files. It covered 20 months. It named Doyle and the development project, and the holding company, and the flow of money between Doyle's personal accounts and the shell entity that owned the development parcel. And it contained 3 audio files that appeared to be internal police department recordings, the kind captured by high-grade surveillance equipment that the Harwick County PD used for internal affairs reviews, and that was not available to anyone outside a specific tier of administrative clearance. Hayes called Simmons at 11:58. She called back at midnight 22 after reading the file. "Someone inside the department sent this," she said. "Has to be. The recording equipment signature is specific to Harwick PD issue. Who has that access level?" Narrowed to 3 people. Deputy Chief Alan Kramer Y, a Sergeant Nicole Voss, and the records administrator Thomas Phelps. Pull all 3 for questioning tomorrow morning, separately. Don't let them communicate first. Simmons paused. "There's something else." "Tell me." "The email went to you, but a different version of the same package, less complete, more targeted, went to Diane's personal address. 30 minutes earlier than yours. She would have gotten it first." Hayes sat with this for a moment. "What's different in her version?" "The audio is the same. The financial records are the same. But her package includes video. Security footage from the night of her arrest from cameras inside and outside Harwick PD, including angles that shouldn't exist on any externally accessible system. And a text message below the video. Simmons read it. "You are not the hunter. You are the bait." The line was quiet for several seconds. "Someone has been inside this operation from the beginning," Hayes said. "That's what it looks like. Someone who wanted her arrested. Wanted us watching. Wanted the whole thing visible. The question is why." Hayes stood up from his desk and walked to the window. His building had no windows that faced the street, but the one in his office looked out onto an interior courtyard, and he stood there looking at the courtyard lights and the darkness above them, and thinking about the distinction between being used and being useful, about the difference between a trap set for you and a trap you chose to walk into with your eyes open. "Whoever sent this has been sitting on it for months," he said. "They had everything they needed to bring this down from the inside, and they didn't. They waited. For what? For something that would make it undeniable." A pause. Diane getting arrested on camera is undeniable. Me showing up with 8 vehicles because of who she is, that's undeniable. Everything that comes after the grand jury, the indictments that all flows from a moment that's on video and that no one can edit themselves out of. Simmons said, someone needed a catalyst. And they found one in a nurse who asked the right question at the right checkpoint, Diane. When Hayes called her at 12:30 and told her about the email and the video and the message, sat in her kitchen and looked at the dog tag on the table between her and James's empty chair for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "Do you know who sent it?" "Not yet," Hayes said. "Does it matter?" She thought about it seriously the way she thought about things that deserved seriousness. "It matters for how we use it," she said. "It matters for whether we can build a case on it that holds. Legally, we're in the clear. It's not government obtained. The attorneys are already on it." "Then use it," she said. "There's one more thing," Hayes said. "The message. You are not the hunter, you are the bait. Does that worry you?" She was quiet for a moment. Then, "No," she said. "Because bait that knows what it is can set the trap." Hayes was quiet on the other end of the line. Then he said, "Get some sleep." She hung up and sat in the kitchen for another 20 minutes in the quiet of a house where her son was upstairs asleep, and she thought about someone she didn't know who had been watching and waiting and building something in the dark, and who had decided that she was the right person to bring it into the light. And she thought about Corporal Anthony Reeves, who had been 22, and from Savannah, and had not survived the place she survived. And she thought about the fact that being chosen for something was not the same as being protected by it, that the choice was the beginning of work rather than the end of it. Then she went to bed. Patricia Harmon walked into the grand jury room at 9 in the morning without a prepared speech and with a 2-foot by 3-foot map taped to a portable display board, and 23 people who had been pulled from voter rolls and given no advance information about what they were about to hear looked at her and at the map and settled into the specific attentiveness of people who understood they had been put in a room because something needed deciding. She started with the map, and she let the map do a portion of the work. Before she said anything, just pointed to the red areas and the blue areas and the green areas and then to the dots. Each dot, a traffic stop, 247 of them over 18 months, clustering in those 3 zones like a pattern in a fabric that became visible once you stepped back far enough to see the whole length of it. Then she showed them where Whitmore Heights was at the center of the 3 zones, the bullseye. "A lot of people get stopped for a lot of reasons," she said. "Traffic enforcement is a legitimate function of policing. So is crime prevention. So is community safety. But what I'm going to show you today is not traffic enforcement." She paused. "What I'm going to show you today is a blueprint." She played the body cam footage without commentary, all of it from the moment Diane's car stopped to the moment the patrol car pulled away. The room was quiet in a way that had weight to it. William Gaines, the grand jury foreman, a retired teacher with a careful face and reading glasses on a beaded chain around his neck, watched the footage with the expression of someone who was cross-referencing what he was seeing against a long catalog of things he had not wanted to believe were possible. She played the audio from the interview room. Doyle's voice smooth and cold the offer, and then the threat, the sentence about Whitmore Heights, and moving it forward cleanly, the mention of James. A juror in the 3rd row looked away from the speaker when Doyle's voice used the word cleanly, looked down at her hands, looked back up. Harmon showed them the financial records, the wire transfers, the email that used the phrase "increase discomfort" in reference to police activity in the targeted neighborhoods. She showed them Robert Mensah's arrest record and the public defender's notes and the plea agreement that bore his signature and had cost him nothing he had done. She showed them Sandra Ngosi's complaint and the city council's response, "Your matter has been reviewed." She showed them Thomas Ayula's 6-hour detention record, which noted at the bottom in the handwriting of an officer who had apparently forgotten this would be read by someone someday. Subject believes he has rights. The room was very still. 247 stops, Harmon said, standing to the side of the map, not performing, just presenting the way you presented something when you were confident the facts would carry their own weight. 89% of the people stopped were Black or Latino. 73% of those arrested took plea deals. And the neighborhoods where this was happening are the same neighborhoods that sit in the way of a development project that will generate $180 million in revenue for people who are in this room tonight in handcuffs. She let that sit. "These are not mistakes," she said. "This is not a few bad actors in an otherwise healthy system. This is a coordinated effort by people with institutional power to use that power as a tool of removal to make a community feel unsafe, to manufacture the conditions under which families would sell homes they had lived in for generations, so that other people could become very rich by standing on the empty ground." She paused. "And the only reason you are hearing about this today, the only reason any of this is visible, is that one night they stopped the wrong car." She sat down. The grand jury deliberated for 37 minutes, which was not a long time given the volume of material presented, and was, in another sense, about the right amount of time for 23 people to confirm what the evidence had already established. William Gaines carried the sealed envelope out himself and handed it to the clerk, and Harmon took it in the hallway and opened it, standing next to Hayes, who had waded through the deliberations with his hands in his pockets, and his weight evenly distributed in the stance of a man who had learned that waiting was a form of work. She read the first line, looked up at him. "All of them," she said. He nodded once, the nod of someone receiving confirmation of something they had already treated as fact. Then he pulled out his phone and began making calls. Pruitt was in the middle of morning roll call when they came for him, which was in retrospect a fitting kind of symmetry arrested in the middle of the structure and routine of a life organized around the exercise of authority, taken out of that structure in a single procedural act that could not be appealed or explained away or managed into something smaller. The federal agent who cuffed him did it without theatrics, without any visible satisfaction, just the clean efficiency of someone completing a necessary step in a process. Pruitt did not resist. He did not say anything. He looked once at the faces of the officers standing at their desks, watching him be walked out, and he found in those faces exactly the thing he had feared finding. Not outrage, not sympathy, but the specific look of people who were relieved it was him and not them, and who were busy deciding that they had never known what he was, which was also part of the accountability he was now going to carry. Lang was waiting in the parking lot in his personal car when the federal vehicle pulled in. He had come in early, which told the agents something about his state of mind. He got out of his car when they approached, hands already visible, and he said, "I know," before anyone spoke. The agent said, "Mr. Lang." "I know," he said again. "I've known since the morning after." He had, it turned out, filed a voluntary disclosure to the department's Internal Affairs Office 4 days after Diane's arrest, a disclosure that had sat on the desk of Nicole Voss, the IA sergeant who had not processed it for reasons that were currently under separate investigation. But the disclosure existed. It was logged. It was in the context of everything that followed, a small fact but not a worthless one, and the U.S. Attorney's Office would take it into account. Doyle was arrested at his home at 6 in the morning, the timing chosen deliberately before the morning news cycle, before his lawyers could coordinate a strategy, before he could make calls to the people whose names he had been carrying as insurance for 2 decades. He came to the door in a bathrobe, which was the undignified timing of federal arrest, and there was a moment where he stood on his doorstep with his coffee cup still in his hand, and the agent holding the warrant and the blue lights of the federal vehicles reflecting in the windows of the house his development money had bought, and he looked very much like a man who had spent his entire career calculating the odds and had finally in one night miscalculated in a way that could not be corrected by any of the tools he had available. He did not say anything to the agents. He went inside to change under supervision and came out in slacks and a button-down that he had put on in the wrong order collar slightly off-center the first time in Diane's experience of him that he had appeared as anything other than entirely composed. The photographs ran on the news at noon and at Greystone Memorial. The break room television was on because it was always on at noon, and the faces of the morning shift gathered around it. The way faces gathered around things that were simultaneously terrible and necessary to see. Carol watched Doyle's mugshot appear on the screen, 5'10" silver hair, without the styling. Now the jaw still firm, but the eyes with something gone out of them, and she said nothing, which was unusual for Carol, who generally had something to say. What she was thinking, and did not say, was that the photograph of the man who had threatened a nurse's job and used her teenage son as a bargaining chip, and called the displacement of hundreds of families a development opportunity looked in the absence of his suit and his watch, and the particular arrangement of his face that power had given him like anyone. Like every person who had ever sat across a table from someone with less power and decided the power gap was a license. She reached over and turned the volume down a little because there was something in the room that didn't need a narrator. The trial of Richard Doyle on federal civil rights conspiracy, wire fraud, and deprivation of rights under color of law began on a morning in March, when the light was still the particular pale gray of a winter that hadn't yet decided to end, and Diane Okafor arrived at the federal courthouse on time, which was how she arrived at everything in a dark blazer over her street clothes carrying a leather portfolio, not thinking about what she looked like because that was not the kind of information that was useful to her. She had testified before. Not in this country, not in this context, but in the kind of after-action reviews and official inquiries that happen in the wake of military operations, where the central skill is the same. Tell the truth in the order it occurred without embellishment, without editorial, without giving the person on the other side of the table anything to work with other than the facts themselves. The defense attorney was a man named Gerald Voss, 71 years old, silver-haired with the practiced equanimity of someone who had defended powerful people through serious charges for long enough that his face had settled into a permanent expression of reasonable skepticism. He had, in 3 previous cross-examinations in this trial, attempted to chip away at the federal case by attacking the credibility of witnesses through the suggestion that their accounts were shaped by personal grievance rather than accurate recollection. He tried a version of this with Diane. "Ms. Okafor," he said, standing at a comfortable distance from the witness box in the stance of someone who was not confronting but was inviting a conversation. "You have federal credentials, correct? An active relationship with the Defense Intelligence Agency." "A consulting relationship," she said. "Yes. And when you were stopped at the checkpoint on November 14th, you were aware that revealing those credentials would likely change the dynamic of the encounter." "Yes." "But you chose not to reveal them." "Yes." "And isn't it possible," he said with the careful framing of someone setting a snare, "that you made that choice in order to generate the circumstances we're discussing in this trial? That you deliberately withheld information that would have ended the stop in order to create a situation that would support these charges?" She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the jury. 12 people, a retired school administrator, 2 teachers, a healthcare worker, a contractor, a small business owner, a mix of people who had driven through neighborhoods like East Side and perhaps had not thought much about what it felt like to live there. And she spoke to them rather than to Voss, the way her training had taught her to speak to the people whose understanding was the actual goal. "I withheld my credentials," she said, "because most people don't have them, because the 247 people who were stopped at that checkpoint over 18 months did not have federal clearances to flash when an officer decided they were a problem. They had only what everyone in this country is supposed to have the right to ask why, and when they asked, they were arrested." She paused. "I withheld them because I wanted to see what this system did to people who didn't have my resources. And now we all know," Voss said. "So you essentially ran an experiment." "I drove home from work," she said. "And I asked one question. What happened after that was their choice, not mine." 3 members of the jury were looking at her with an attention that was different from what it had been before she spoke. The fourth was looking at the floor, but in the way people looked at floors when they were thinking hard. Not in the way they looked at floors when they wanted to be somewhere else. Robert Mensah took the stand after the lunch recess. He had brought his daughter's drawing to the courthouse not to show it, just to have it with him folded in his breast pocket. The crayon drawing of his house that she had made for him the week after he was released from the 2-night detention, the one that said "Daddy's Home" in big, uncertain letters across the top. He had told Diane about it the first time they met, and she had said, "Bring it. It'll remind you why you're doing this." He held himself in the witness box with the careful, upright posture of someone who had decided consciously and recently to take up the full space he was entitled to. He described the stop, the arrest, the 2 nights in county, the plea agreement, the signature he had put on a document that said he had done something wrong on a night when he had done nothing wrong. His voice was even and unadorned, the voice of someone who was not trying to make you feel something but was trusting you to feel it when you heard the truth. Sandra Ngozi came next with her manila folder and her sticky tabs and her 4 stopped car incidents, organized by date, and she placed the folder on the railing of the witness box with the deliberate care of someone who had carried it for a long time and was finally putting it down in the right place. She read the city council's response letter aloud. "Your matter has been reviewed and addressed according to established procedures," in the flat voice of someone reading a document whose content was its own indictment. She did not add anything to it. She did not need to. Thomas Ayula spoke last among the civilian witnesses, and he was of the 3, the one who most visibly felt the weight of the room and did not fully manage to contain it. And that was all right, because the weight of the room was real, and containing it entirely was not actually the requirement. The requirement was to tell the truth, which he did in the careful sentences of a young man who had been shaped by years of training himself to be precise with language, because precision in medicine was the difference between help and harm. When he said, "I spent 6 hours trying to understand what I had done wrong," he paused, not for effect, but because the sentence required it, because he was arriving at something that was still true in the present, and not just in the memory of a night 11 months ago. It took me a long time after that to understand that the answer was nothing, that I was stopped because of how I looked and where I was walking, and the conclusion they had already drawn before I said a word. He looked at the jury with the direct gaze of someone who had decided to tell the truth in the most complete way available to him. "I'm going to be a doctor in 4 months. I'm going to work in this community, and I need to be able to walk home at night without wondering if tonight is the night it happens again." The jury deliberated for 2 hours and 20 minutes. They came back with a guilty verdict on all counts. Doyle stood in the well of the court and heard the word "guilty" come down across him like something falling, like the specific weight of all the decisions that had led to this room, and his face did not move very much, which was the face of someone who had prepared for this possibility and found that preparation did not actually make it feel like what they had prepared for. His sentencing came 3 weeks later, 11 years. Pruitt 7 with the possibility of 3 suspended based on cooperation. Lang 4. The others in the network, through plea agreements and cooperation arrangements in numbers that filled a page of the federal docket, and that Simmons had organized into a document she presented to Hayes with the detached precision of someone compiling a final accounting. Diane heard the verdict on her phone in the hospital parking lot between patients. She read the text from Hayes that said "all counts, all defendants," and she sat in her car for a moment and looked at the steering wheel, and then at the hospital entrance where she was due back in 4 minutes for a patient handover. She thought, it is not enough. It is also not nothing. She got out of the car and went back to work. The hospital organized what Carol called a meeting, and what it actually was turned out to be something that filled the break room past its comfortable capacity on a Tuesday afternoon. Between shift changes, people standing along the walls and in the doorway. Not quite a gathering, and not quite a ceremony, but something in the territory between them which was probably the right space for what it was trying to do. Carol said a few things. Nothing prepared, nothing that built to a particular point. Just a few things she had been carrying for the weeks since it happened, and wanted to put down somewhere that Diane had worked there for 8 years, and that 8 years was a long time to work alongside someone and not know the full shape of who they were, and that the not knowing was partly Diane's choice and her right, and partly a failure of attention on everyone else's part, and that in the gap between those two things there was a lesson that Carol thought was worth naming. Nobody disputed this. The room had a quality of people standing in a truth they had agreed to enter, rather than the truth having been imposed on them, which was a better feeling thing, even if the truth was the same. Roger Pitts was there. He stood near the back, which was also where he had stood at every gathering this size for his entire tenure at Greystone, and he did not try to say anything until most people had left, and then he found Patrice in the hallway outside, pulling on her coat to leave. He said I was wrong. Not just about what I said in the break room, about all of it. About the calculus I've been running for 20 years that says not making trouble is the same as not causing harm. He said it without looking at the ceiling or his shoes or the middle distance, just at her, which was harder. It isn't the same thing. I understand that now. Patrice looked at him for a moment. She thought about the version of herself 2 years ago, driving away from a checkpoint in careful silence, and the version of herself now, and the distance between them, and how it felt less like progress than like arriving somewhere she should have been earlier. Next time something's wrong, she said, say so when it's happening, not after. She paused. There will be a next time. There always is. He nodded. She put on her coat and left. Later that evening, she found the staff petition still on Carol's desk, the one with 412 names on it. She picked up a pen that was sitting nearby and on the last empty line wrote Roger's name herself in her handwriting, not because he had asked her to, but because she thought he had earned it by about 3 degrees and she was willing to extend the remainder as credit. 3 weeks after the verdict, on an evening in early April, when the light had finally decided to stay a little longer and the air had the first quality of warmth it had been withholding since October, James was in the kitchen doing homework when Diane came home from a day shift. The unusual morning shift she had picked up to cover for someone who needed a day for a medical appointment, and she came in through the back door and set her bag down and saw him sitting at the table with the dog tag in front of him, not on his neck, but on the table, which was where he had left it the morning she told him about Anthony Reeves. It had been on the table for 3 weeks. Neither of them had moved it. She made coffee and sat down across from him, and he closed his laptop, which meant there was something he wanted to say. I looked up his family, he said. She waited. Corporal Reeves. He had a sister in Savannah. She's 34 now. She has a daughter. He paused. I found her on Instagram. Her daughter plays soccer. Diane looked at him. At 16, he had the face that moved between the boy she had raised and the man he was becoming with a frequency she sometimes found disorienting and sometimes, like right now, found extraordinary. I thought about messaging her, he said, Anthony's sister. But I didn't know what to say. I didn't want to open something up and then not know how to close it. That was thoughtful, she said. Is it okay that I looked? Yes, she said. It's okay. He picked up the dog tag and turned it in his fingers. You kept this because you couldn't forget him, he said. Not because you failed him. She looked at him across the table. She had told herself many versions of the story of Anthony Reeves over 13 years, and the version her 16-year-old had just offered her was the one she had been least able to give herself because it was simpler and more true than the versions that involved guilt and simplicity, had not been a form of mercy she had found easy to extend to herself in the years before she understood that the keeping of something was not always about unfinished grief. Yes, she said. That's right. He set the dog tag down in the center of the table between them, and she reached out and picked it up and held it for a moment, and then she placed it in the front pocket of her hospital scrubs, the breast pocket where it sat against her sternum with the small, solid weight of something real. What are you going to do next? He asked. After all of this. Tomorrow I have the early shift, she said. The usual. And after that. She thought about the city council hearing she had been asked to speak at next month about the civilian oversight proposal that Hayes's office was working with the U.S. attorney to formalize about the 18 families whose cases were being reviewed for property remediation, about the 42 people whose charges were being expunged one at a time in the careful bureaucratic machinery of a system being pushed to correct itself from the inside. After that, she said more of the same. He nodded like that was the right answer. Then he opened his laptop again and went back to his homework, and she drank her coffee, and the kitchen was very quiet and very ordinary, which was the best thing it could be. 3 weeks after the checkpoint on Riverside and 9th was officially decommissioned and the orange cones were collected and the patrol cars were reassigned and the city issued a statement describing the previous arrangement as an operational protocol that did not meet current standards of community policing. Someone planted flowers in the gap where the largest cone had stood, not planted them deliberately in the sense of a ceremony. There was no ceremony, no one watching, no cameras, but planted them in the sense that seeds were put in the ground in that spot one morning before the city was fully awake. And then it rained, and then it was spring, and the gap where the cone had been became by May a small, ragged cluster of black-eyed Susans growing out of the cracked asphalt at the edge of the curb. Nobody moved them. The city's maintenance crew drove past them twice a week for the rest of the summer, and the crew chief, who had lived in Eastside for 40 years, told his team to work around them. Patrice Webb submitted her application to the city's new Civilian Police Oversight Board on a Monday morning in late April. In the box marked "Reason for Applying," she wrote, "Because I drove away from something I should have stayed for, and I don't want to do that again." Robert Mensah wrote her letter of recommendation on the back of a page of notebook paper in handwriting that was careful and deliberate in the way of a man who took seriously what he was signing his name to. The board reviewed her application and brought her in for an interview and asked her, among other things, whether she had any prior experience with law enforcement accountability work, and she said no, but that she had learned recently that experience wasn't always the starting point. Sometimes the starting point was just deciding you were done being a bystander. And the board member who was asking the question wrote something in her notes, and the next week Patrice received a letter. On a Tuesday evening in June, Diane Okafor drove home from her night shift down Riverside Avenue the way she always did, past the church and the corner store and the row houses with their window boxes full of the particular summer flowers that people planted, not to impress anyone, but because it was June and things were alive, and being alive wanted to be expressed. And she went through the intersection of Riverside and 9th at 11:53 in the evening, the same time she had gone through it on the night in November that had changed a lot of things she had not expected to change, and the intersection was empty and open and lit by the same sodium streetlight that had been there for years, and the black-eyed Susans at the curb were closed for the night the way they closed at dark, not dead, just resting. She did not stop. She drove through and kept going toward home, toward James asleep upstairs, and the back door unlocked the way she had kept it for 11 years, toward the hospital in the morning, and the shift after that, and the work that did not end, because the need for it did not end. The dog tag rested in her breast pocket against her sternum, warm from her skin. She pressed her hand to it once briefly, and then put both hands back on the wheel, and she drove the rest of the way home in the summer dark through a neighborhood that was still standing. If this story moved something in you, if you saw yourself in the people who stayed quiet, or in the one who didn't leave a comment below, tell us what justice means to you in your neighborhood, in your city. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next story. Because these aren't just stories, they're mirrors. And sometimes what you see in a mirror is the first step toward changing what you do next.